Hello? Almost ready. Let's see. Should start recording in just a bit. Okay, so we're just going to blow through this. This is nervous system 2, and it'll include a little bit on the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, and it focuses mainly on the spinal cord. All right, the spinal cord. Afferent signals go up it, efferent signals go down it. It helps process and integrate information. It's responsible for some reflexes, some what they call spinal reflexes. That's reflexes that go into your spinal cord and then right back out. So they don't involve the brain. So it goes from the foramen magnum to about the L1, L2 area. Spinal cord growth stops around age 4. But the vertebral column keeps growing until you reach your full height. So that's why when you're doing a spinal tap on a young child, you have to be a lot more careful because generally you're going in between L3 and L4, and so you're a lot closer to the spinal cord in a child. You don't want to hit that if you're trying to take out cerebrospinal fluid. So the spinal cord tapers to a conus medullaris. Phylum terminale originates at the tip. It's a strand of fibrous tissue, and it helps join, and it joins to the coccygeal ligament down there. So it's anchoring the spinal cord inferiorly. So remember, the spinal cord ends around lumbar 1, lumbar 2 area in the conus medullaris. That's like a little cone shape. It just tapers. Okay, and it's got its own name, conus medullaris. So do you have 3 layers of meninges around the spinal cord? Yeah, dura, mater, arachnoid, technically it's mater, and pia mater. So just like around the brain, the same thing. The dura mater is superficial, the arachnoid sandwiched in between the dura and the pia is right against the spinal cord. I'm not going to put denticulate ligaments on this test, but they're just lateral extensions of the pia that help anchor the spinal cord laterally. So I don't like this drawing that much, but it's showing you the dura, okay? And the arachnoid's pretty bad drawing, but the P is fairly decent. All right, I like this. So if you look here, this is the back, you're right? So this is posterior and that's anterior. You can also call that dorsal and that ventral, which I tend to do when I'm talking about the spinal cord. Just seems easier. So here's the dura. I would never point at it on this view, but I could point at the epidural fat or the epidural space, which is filled with fat. That way I get a 2 for 1. I know that you know that it's outside the dura and you know that it's a space and it's filled with fat. So let's look at the spinal cord the way it's arranged. See, the white matter is on the outside, and this butterfly shape, that's gray matter. So that's mostly neurons, right? Now you got a little hole right here. That's your central canal. That's very important. And then you have this fissure. That's another way you can tell you're looking at the front because it's the anterior median fissure. A fissure is bigger than a sulcus. See this posterior median sulcus, which I'm not going to do on this test. Anterior median fissure, I guess that's fair game, right? You look at the little gray horns here. They look like horns, and that's exactly what they named it. Dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn, okay? And we'll go a little bit into the function of those later. This is a white column, so you call it a posterior white column, lateral white column, anterior white column. That's your little denticulate ligament. It's not going to be on the test, but you can see them really well here. This is a dorsal root ganglion. Remember a ganglion is a collection of neurons outside the CNS? Yeah. So if I cut into that, I would find a lot of unipolar neurons, or pseudo-unipolar, as your book now calls them. And one of the little parts of the fiber would be going into here, because remember, those are general, those are basically general sensory, neurons. So let's say you were, way out here, you had like a receptor, out by your arm or your hand, and the fiber for that unipolar is going in here. He belongs to one of those unipolar, neurons inside of there, and the other part of that pole goes in here, synapses in the gray matter, and then that's going to get in the white matter and send a signal up to the brain. We're not going to worry about that too much, but you're going to end up on the parietal lobe, because general sensory is processed in the parietal lobes. And we're not going to worry about a signal crossing over, the way things usually cross over, from one side of the body to the other side of the brain. We're not going to worry about that. All right. So this little structure is called a root. So it's on the dorsal side, so you call it a dorsal root. This is a root also, but you call it the ventral root. Well, let's look at this. Ventral horn. It's got neurons inside of it, and they're motor neurons, so they're probably shaped multipolar. Remember, multipolar shape? So let's just trace one. If we had one neuron in here, he sends his fiber out here. It's trying to go, say, to that same hand to do some motor with the skeletal muscle. So that fiber, there's plenty of more fibers running right next to him that are doing different, muscles or motor units. So that's going to go on out, and it's going to go on out to a muscle somewhere. Say it's in your finger or your hand, and then it's going to cause a contraction. So that's purely motor. So if I took some scissors and I cut this ventral root, I would only lose motor. Whereas if I took some scissors and I cut this dorsal root, I would lose sensory from somewhere. Here, I would lose motor to somewhere, because there's way more than one axon in here. Does that make sense? You got lots of neurons here sending lots of fibers to lots of places. One neuron may be controlling a motor unit in the muscle next to your backbone. So that fiber would end up going here, out to some muscles out here, like maybe those intertransverse area or whatever. So that would cause a contraction somewhere in your back, right? Where a totally another neuron would send its fiber, say, out to the finger or the hand or the wherever, shoulder. You got lots of these guys. So it's important to understand that one neuron is controlling one specific axon. So in other words, they can't split. This neuron, this axon coming off of it is not going to split there and split there. That would make no sense, because then you would contract somewhere maybe in your hand and somewhere in your back. No, it's totally separate neurons that do that. Same thing on your sensory, totally separate neurons. Okay. And there's a lot of these things. So don't forget, this is anatomy. Don't get too hung up in the physiology here, or the function. So if I point there, go dorsal horn. If I point there, go lateral horn. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we point there, you go ventral horn. If I point there, you go posterior white column, lateral white column, anterior white column, anterior median fissure, central canal, ventral root, dorsal root ganglion, and these are called ramus plural. That's a ventral ramus, and that's a dorsal ramus. So you notice the way we were tracing sensory and motor through here. Some of the axons were doing that, some were coming from here. So in other words, these are two-way streets. So if I cut that, I'm going to lose sensory and motor somewhere. If I cut this ramus, I'm going to lose sensory and motor somewhere over my back. Okay. All righty. Don't stress on this, but that's an autonomic or sympathetic ganglion. They're in a chain. There's a bunch of them running up and down. They're all connected, um, one to another, and that'll help send out a sympathetic response. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so everybody's cool? Ramus, dorsal root ganglion, root, horn, horn, horn. I'm not going to ask you about the little commissure, the gray commissure. That's just the gray matter that's going on either side of this central canal. You got an anterior and posterior gray commissure. Too little to point at, but I could point at the central canal. All right, I think we're good. DAVE, what does that mean? The dorsal region of the spinal cord carries afferent signals. So I'm going to simplify it a little more than that. Your sensory signals are coming in to the dorsal side. Your ventral, those are afferent signals, dorsal afferent. Ventral efferent, so going out the ventral, right? Those are motor signals, DAVE. So look at that again. Dorsal afferent, ventral efferent. In other words, if I scratch somewhere on my back, right, that signal is going to come in and synapse in my dorsal horn region. If I scratch on my arm or my stomach or whatever, that's going to come in, same thing, and land on a dorsal horn. Depending on what level of the spinal cord you're at, you would be going through a ramus. But now if you don't always, we'll get to rami. I mean, yeah, we'll get to that again. Okay? All right. So this will make a lot more sense when you see it. The lateral horns we were talking about a minute ago, white columns we talked about. They also call them funiculi. I call them columns, easier. And each column contains a tract. Each column contains a tract, okay, or tracts. So this is what I want to show you. So remember, this is anterior now because we're looking at the anterior median fissure, and there's dorsal, and there's a posterior median sulcus. So if a signal's coming in here from somewhere in the body, sensory signal, it's going to land in this dorsal horn, right? If you're sending a voluntary motor, something you can control, it's leaving from these ventral horns, okay? So this is what you control. This is motor, somatic motor, that's under your control. Remember we talked a little bit about visceral motor, it's not under your control, smooth muscle, cardiac, and glands. Well, that would be leaving from a lateral horn in a sympathetic response. So don't forget, you get scared, the signal comes down to white matter and it's synapsing in your lateral horns. Your lateral horns are controlling, let's just talk about the heart, right? It's going to send a neuron in here might have an axon that's going towards your heart, right? And there's going to be a ganglion in between. We're not going to stress on that right now, but the other neuron after that synapse in the ganglion is going to go to the heart and put out a neurotransmitter. And don't stress on it right now. We'll talk about it in a minute, but that's going to be norepinephrine, which is very similar to epinephrine, right? Okay. So that's going to speed your heart up. But still, it's a motor signal. So it's going out the front, ventral efferent. So remember, motor is an efferent. So that's an efferent signal going out the front, DAVE, ventral efferent. And don't stress on this. It's just what parts of your body, these signals are either, these areas are either controlling or the signals are either going through. We're not going to get all hung up in that. That's a much more difficult thing to memorize. So I have asked a question about spinal tap versus an epidural. So a spinal tap, you're taking some fluid out. Remember, we go between L3 and L4 because we're trying to get below the actual spinal cord. You don't want to poke that with your needle. And then say if somebody has meningitis or something, they might take some fluid and look for like white blood cells or pathogens or waste or whatever. Now, if somebody's having a baby and they want to give them an epidural, that's an anesthetic thing. So you're putting something in, but you're not going real deep. You're going into that epidural space or fat, and you're flooding that with your anesthetic and hopefully knocking those nerves out temporarily so that you don't feel pain. That's a causal block. It's very common in childbirth, and you can do that at different levels, um, on the vertebra. Okay. So that's just showing you where they tend to go to do some of these procedures. Well, this would probably be a spinal tap. Okay. So you got 31 paraspinal nerves. I can go, how many paraspinal nerves you got? Blank. Oh, 31. How many cranial nerve pairs? Oh, 12. Don't confuse those two. We'll talk about the specific nerves in a little bit. They're mostly point and name, like a femoral nerve, sciatic nerve we've already seen on our muscle models. Peroneal, they don't use that any. Oh, they spelled that wrong. Peroneal. No one calls it that anymore anyway. They call it the common fibular. Much easier. Just remember which bone it's by. All right, let's look at some more point and name stuff. So this is a nerve. Just say it's a sciatic nerve. So it's kind of got some of the same, almost the same prefixes we use as you do around muscle. Remember, muscle had epimysium. Don't say that on this. This connective tissue would be epineurium. Remember the way the muscles had fascicles? Well, yeah, you still got fascicles, which are basically your axons in here, and they're surrounded by perineurium. Don't say perimysium, that's muscle. And then here is endoneurium, which is around an axon. Of course, it's around the little Schwann cells that are around the axon. Okay, so endoneurium. So if I point that and I go, what connective tissue structure is that? Endoneurium. What connective tissue structure is that? Perineurium. What is that, conglomeration of axons? We call a fascicle. What is the connective tissue around the entire nerve? That would be epineurium. Now, you automatically know you're looking in the periphery because you got Schwann cells. Remember, Schwann cells are periphery, and you have the little gaps in between them. So if I say, what cell is that? You go Schwann cell. What's that little gap? I'm giving you a hint, myelin sheath gap. But I call them nodes of Ranvier. Sometimes your book just says node. And then what is that? That's your axon. Okay? Piece of cake. This is called a plexus. So a plexus is basically a network, and this is going to the brachial region, so it's called the brachial plexus. Notice the way you have, it kind of looks like an M if you follow this right here. It looks like an M. This is on the front of this plexus, and so you follow this guy down off of the one branch of that M. That's the ulnar nerve. That's where you hit your funny bone, right? And makes that one tingle. Then the one going down the middle would be the median nerve. Don't say medial or middle, it's median. And then the one going out here over your skin and then over this biceps and brachialis region, that would be your musculocutaneous because it's going to those muscles in the skin, cutaneous. Now, you can't really see, well, you can barely see a little piece of it, but this M behind it, two important nerves come off. So the axillary nerve, which, you go, it's going through that axillary region, and it's going to the deltoid, by the way. And then there's also your radial nerve, which oddly enough starts out behind and then it wraps around and then it ends up coming down. And it basically does your wrist extensors. So I could go, what two nerves are on the posterior of the brachial plexus? And then you'd go radial and axillary. Okay. So here's your plexi. No, actually it's plexuses. I don't know why. Normally in Latin you think it'd be plexi, but no. Cervical plexus, I'm not going to ask you C1 through C5, but in med school or PA school, they probably will. Same thing with the brachial plexus. I'm not going to ask you C5 through T1 region, right? I'm not going to ask you these numbers. But I could just put a bracket like this on a picture and go, what? What is that? You go cervical plexus. What network is that? Cervical plexus. What network is that? Brachial plexus. What network is this? Lumbar plexus. What network is this that's leading into that sciatic nerve? You'd go sacral plexus. Okay. Where's our thoracic plexus? You don't have one. There is a true or false. You have a thoracic plexus. No. So this spinal nerve just comes straight off, right? And then as it goes around to the front, it's going to go through that costal groove. Remember those costal grooves on your ribs? Okay. But now there is no thoracic plexus. So if you damage that right there, you would lose sensory, like in a little strip, kind of following a rib, basically. You might, well, motor too, but mainly you would notice the numbness. Reflex arc. Remember, these are spinal reflexes. Generally, there's 5 components. Every now and then there's 4. But I could just go, name the 5 components of a reflex arc. So you put your hand on a hot stove. You're going to pull your hand off of there really fast before you even have time to think about it, right? So it's a spinal reflex, okay? So let's look at, well, just act like this is a hot stove instead of a tag, same thing. Pain receptors, that's the first component. The sensory pathway, notice it's a unipolar neuron, general sensory, and it's sending its other part of its little fiber into the dorsal horn through that dorsal root. You don't have to name that, you just go sensory neuron. This little guy is called an interneuron, so it's kind of processing. It's acting like a little brain. It's kind of like, whoa, something bad's happening out there to my hand. I better move it. Talk straight to the motor neuron. So now you got your motor pathway, and then you have your effector. Boop, you're going to pull your hand off of there with the skeletal muscles. That's the effectors, the skeletal muscle. Okay. So that's the 5 components. If I had you draw it, which I doubt I will since it's not a paper test, you just have to do blanks like this. This is fine. Receptor, sensory pathway, interneuron, motor pathway, effector. Now, let's see if I can find it. But anyway, not all of them have an interneuron. I just want you to realize that when you get to physiology. You know, when they hit your little, right below your kneecap with a little rubber hammer to make your leg kick out to test your reflexes. For some reason, that one actually does not have an interneuron. So basically this little fiber talks straight to this motor neuron. Why? I don't know. Maybe it makes it quicker or something. But not all of them have an interneuron. But when I ask a question, I'll say the 5 components because I'm wanting you to put it. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about your visceral motor. Remember, somatic motor is under your control, right? Visceral motor is not under your control. That's called the autonomic nervous system. So when you see this, you think sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic, would keep it simple, fight or flight. Don't worry about the mating stuff down here. We'll get to that in reproductive. So just go fight or flight. And parasympathetic, go rest and digest. You know, that's the effects. Don't worry about the sex stuff. And, you know, we'll get to that when we get to reproduction. All right. So sympathetic, think of everything that happens when you get scared. Do your eyes dilate? Yeah. Do your bronchioles in your lungs dilate to bring in more air? Yeah. So you can run or fight? Yeah. Do you sweat maybe to help cool you down? Yeah. So everything that happens, that's a sympathetic effect. So notice the way the sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar division. Very important. Remember those lateral horns that we were showing a little while ago? They're only in the T1 through L2 region of your spinal cord. Hence, that's why the sympathetic is called the thoracolumbar division. I can go, what's another name for the sympathetic division? Thoracolumbar. What's another name for the parasympathetic division? Craniosacral. So when you're resting, when you're scared, so you're walking through the woods and you see a bear, you know, think of everything that happens. Those signals that are coming out of your spinal cord are leaving from the T1 through L2 region. Now then you got away from the bear and you're telling the story around the campfire. Your parasympathetic's in control because you're about to eat and it's rest and digest time. So you got some signals coming out of 4 cranial nerves. I'm not going to even stress on which ones. For those of you that want to know, it's 3, 7, 9, and 10, and 3 sacral nerves, which would be S, 2, 3, and 4. But just know they're coming out of cranial nerves and sacral nerves. Okay, and that's going to rest and digest. All right, we'll talk about the adrenal gland in a little bit, but can the adrenal gland pump out adrenaline, otherwise known as epinephrine, that's going to get in your bloodstream and cause a lot of these same effects, speeding your heart up, dilating your bronchioles? Yeah, it's just a way to get that, it's an emergency situation. You got to get everything going. And so that helps, you're not just relying on the neural, neurotransmitters. All right. So if you look here, T1 through L2. So when you get scared, if you were looking at the front of this, those signals will be coming out the front because they're motor of your spinal cord through those ventral roots. Okay. If you're resting and digesting, those signals are coming out of these 4 cranial nerves and 3 of these sacral nerves. That's just the way we're wired. I don't know. Okay. Why? It's just the way we are. Don't stress on this right now. Let's go to here. All right, we're looking at the front. So notice the way these guys are leaving from the front of the spinal cord, and then most of them are synapsing somewhere in this chain of ganglia. Remember we talked about the sympathetic ganglia on that other one? I said they're in a chain. So those signals can go up and down this chain and spread out real quick. So that's divergence. Okay. And so let's just follow one to the heart. See the way, say you're going to synapse, maybe right here. Okay. And we're just following one axon. It's going to synapse with another neuron. So this little fiber is pretty short because this sympathetic chain is close by. Then your next one's going to be long because you got to go all the way out to the heart and put out your norepinephrine. So it's just kind of a general rule. Your first fiber in the sympathetic is short because mainly you're synapsing in this chain. And then the second ones are long. There are some exceptions to that, and some of them are a little longer. You do have these ganglia that are a little further away, but you'll get those in physiology. I'm not going to even go over them here too much. Okay. All right. And going to the adrenal gland, it's a big exception. That's long, and then there's a little synapse there, and it's short. So that's a big exception. So don't stress on it. Most of the time, first fiber is short, second fiber is long. Okay. This, just the way we're wired, is backwards. It's still a ganglion somewhere. There's little ganglia all over the place, right in here, right? So let's just go to the heart again, right? Your first fiber, look how long it is. Then it's going to synapse. There's little ganglia over here. And it's going to synapse in one of those, right? And then you're going to put it out onto your SA node, which we don't even know what that is yet, but you're going to put out acetylcholine, which is going to slow the heart down. Notice the way we used acetylcholine at the effector for parasympathetic, but we used norepinephrine at the effector for the thoracolumbar or the sympathetic. So remember that. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. Right? Nope, not yet. Okay. This is what that's talking about. Don't stress on this too much, but they're just comparing the sympathetic coming out of the nervous system with the parasympathetic coming out of the nervous system. Notice the way the first one's short. You do your little synapse, and the second one's long. So this is called the postganglionic fiber is long. The preganglionic fiber is short. And then you put out norepi on your whatever, smooth muscle cardiac or glands. Notice it's in green right there. That's showing norepi. Where here, first one's long, second fiber's short. And what are you putting out? Acetylcholine. Right? See in blue, acetylcholine. And don't even worry about what you're putting out in the ganglion. But if you know, you notice it's acetylcholine. You use acetylcholine in a lot of places. So if you had to guess on on a question like this, guess acetylcholine, and you're usually right, except for down here. Okay, and here your adrenal gland is putting out epi and norepi, which are acting almost like hormones in this case, but they're still having the same effects as this norepinephrine here. All right, so don't stress on this too much. I could ask you, the sympathetic system puts out what neurotransmitter on the effector? And you would go norepi. The parasympathetic system puts out uh, what neurotransmitter on the effector? And you would go acetylcholine. Okay, just remember acetylcholine slows the heart down, norepi speeds it up, and then you won't get lost. Okay, so we skipped a lot of stuff, but that's it in a nutshell. So, see here, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, 10, encephalic nerve 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, I'm not going to even ask you that unless you really, really want me to, if you want a bonus or something. But yeah, just make sure you know craniosacral versus thoracolumbar. Not going to do a tracing, but this is just following. We're not doing synapses along the way or anything, but we're just talking about when you want to extend your wrist, you're just tracing where does that signal physically go through your nervous system. And, you know, it's going down the internal capsule, then midbrain, pons, medulla, then out your spinal cord, it goes into your horn, because this is voluntary. Anterior horn, ventral root, ventral ramus, brachial plexus, radial nerve, because it's an extensor, but it's just kind of cool to trace that signal. But I'm not going to ask you to trace one on the test. This is kind of the opposite. Somebody scratching your back stimulates the mechanoreceptors, which goes into your thoracic nerves. Notice there's no plexus involved. Goes into your dorsal ramus, dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, dorsal horn. Going to go through the thalamus, because almost everything sensory goes through the thalamus. Then it's going to shoot up that white matter. It go up the internal capsule to your parietal lobe. So I could ask, when you scratch someone on the back, what lobe of the brain is it processing? Parietal lobe. When you're making a voluntary motion, what lobe of the brain is firing? And that would be your motor cortex of your frontal lobe, right? Okay. And this is just showing you, here's your voluntary, there's your involuntary. So that's somatic and that's visceral. See the lateral horn? So follow the, I don't like the way they drew this because they made this signal split. That doesn't happen. They just did that. They should be showing two separate motor neurons for this, right? One going to the back, one going to, say, your arm or whatever, ventral body wall, whatever. So those would be completely separate neurons, but that's voluntary. Visceral, say this is, look where it's going, it's probably your sympathetic chain. So the first one's short, second one's going to be long. So voluntary motor, involuntary motor. Now, on a voluntary, is there a ganglion in between this neuron and the effector? No. That little fiber goes all the way out to that muscle on your hand or your arm or wherever you're going, puts out acetylcholine there, remember on muscle test, and causes that contraction. So there is no ganglion in the voluntary motor. There are ganglia, like sympathetic chain ganglia, or in the involuntary motor. Same thing with your parasympathetic, you're going to have ganglia. So in the sympathetic and parasympathetic, there's always two neurons in that final pathway to the effector. There's always a ganglion. Why? I don't know. And it's just showing you sensory signals coming in. They shouldn't have split it like this. That would be two different red neurons and two different blue neurons, right? So they don't split. Those would be separate fibers, okay? But where they land in dorsal horn, okay? And so, oh, there's a good example. See, hitting with a little rubber hammer, and there is no inner neuron in that patellar reflex. I don't know why. Maybe it just makes it a little bit quicker. Now, does your brain get the signal eventually? Yeah, you're gonna send a signal. And I think these actually can split and send it in the white matter to the brain. Notice the way it's crossing across. Most things do that in the nervous system. And so, yeah, but that's going to take a long time to get there. And it's like, hey, dummy, look what you did. You put your hand on the tag. I've already got him off of there. But, you know, they just let you know what happened. Okay. This is just point name your plexuses. Oh, I could ask this. Phrenic nerve goes to your diaphragm. So that would be a bonus. And I don't have a good place to point at the phrenic. So I would probably just ask a question. What controls your diaphragm, phrenic? And for you guys going to med school, there's a little saying. You see these cervical nerves, the ones coming off of 3, 4, and 5, keep your diaphragm alive. I just thought that was a cool saying. Make sure you can point out axillary, musculocutaneous, or point at these, go thoracic. I would use a better model to point at ulnar and radial and median. Just pay attention if I'm asking network, I'm asking plexus. Going down the back of the leg would be sciatic. These are pretty good. So the ulnar is pretty good. The median's pretty good. I'm not that crazy about the way they did the radial on these views. I would use a muscle arm, or I don't know. The bonus radial nerve works the extensors of your wrist. True or false? There you go. True. Okay. Don't forget, axillary and radial are coming off behind that M. See the way you're looking at the back of the arm here? And here's the M, so you're looking at the front of the plexus here. Same thing here. Make sure you can find the sciatic nerve going down the back. It's going to branch into the common fibular. They don't call it peroneal anymore. And the tibial. So I can go A, B, C. Oh, don't forget gluteals. Those are nice and easy. D. What are those nerves? Gluteal. What's that one? Sciatic. What's that branch? Common fibular. What's that? Tibial. Here, I love to do this question. Sometimes I just ask, what nerve goes through the obturator foramen? And I'm just trying to give away a point. Obturator nerve, right? The femoral, I would point right here because it splits into a bunch of different branches. But if I point right here, just go femoral nerve. And this, see this guy coming off of here? That's the saphenous nerve. You have a big old blood vessel, a vein that's called the great saphenous vein, that it goes right beside. Okay, so everything with a box. I wouldn't point at femoral up here. I would do it like right there. Okay, and that's pretty much it. I think we're done. Okay, so let's stop share and then end the session. All right, that's the end of this one.